When you watch Formula One now, if you're eagle-eyed or a driving coach, you will notice that all of the drivers use quite a similar driving style. Like pretty much exactly the same. They are very smooth coming off the brakes, then one sweep of the steering wheel into the corner, and then out of the corner, and smooth on the throttle again. That's it. All of them do it from Lewis through to Nikita. Mostly. So what's going on? Drivers used to be wrestling the cars, using mad throttle or braking techniques, or even creating a bucket load of understeer deliberately, as Alonso did for a while. And Senna was the perfect example. Undeniably rapid, but with violent steering inputs, smashing the throttle on and off, as well as sliding the car, having it move around a lot of the time. So that raises the question, would Senna be fast in a current 2022 Formula One car? Now, I have broken down a lot of different drivers' driving styles on this channel. It was actually the Alonso video which kind of kicked things off for Driver 61. He would drive in a deliberately horrible style, inducing massive understeer, heating up the famously hard-wearing Michelins to give them enough grip on the exit of the corner. Then there's Schumacher. He drove the car very hard into the corner and rotated it mid-corner. This meant he was actually slower mid-corner, but he more than made up for it on the entry and with a brilliant exit. But now, if you look at Verstappen versus Hamilton, the way they drive the car is remarkably similar. Honestly, go watch some of the onboards. After this, of course, I would love to include them on this channel, but we're not allowed. So what's up with that? Have they just cracked the secret to driving quickly? Or is it the cars that means everyone drives quite similarly now? Well, let's look back at Senna. Over his time in Formula One, he drove a lot of different cars, all of which needed driving completely differently. So he always needed to adapt his driving style to the car in question. And it's quite a collection of cars. Starting in 1984, he drove the Toleman, which was at the beginning of the turbo era. Then throughout his time in F1, there were cars through the changes from ground effect, driver aids, turbos and gearbox changes, from H-pattern to paddle shift. That is a big change to get used to. And each of these cars required very different driving styles, particularly the turbos. So Senna was famous for his throttle technique. He used to stamp on the throttle, blipping it throughout the entire corner. Of course, if you did this in today's car, you would be straight in the Barrier. Also, imagine doing this with the new ERS system. The deploy would have no idea what's going on. But Senna did this because of the engine. The majority of the car's power was only available when the turbo was spooled up, a bit like an Escort Cosworth or something with lots of turbo lag. So Senna was just using this weird throttle technique to keep the boost pressure up, so that when he did get on the throttle properly coming out of the corner, his turbo was producing more boost than the competitors. Very clever that, and it must have been incredibly hard to do, but of course, he was Ayrton Senna. But one of the main differences between then and now is grip. The cars had a lot of power and comparatively less grip. Really, you have to think about this as a ratio. It's like the difference between a supercar and a Formula 3 car or something like that. What I mean is that in a car with less power compared to grip, you drive a rounded arc through the corner. This is so you can keep the minimum corner speed as high as possible and use all of that grip. But if you're in something with more power compared to the grip, a supercar is actually a great example of this. Loads of power, but still uses road tyres and doesn't tend to have too much aero. You will take less of a smooth arc through the corner and more of a V-shape. This means you can get the car in a straight line as soon as possible. And this helps you get on the power and exit the corner faster. But what you see from Senna and Schumacher and a load of drivers from back then was them driving the car into the corner hard, rotating it with a brute force kind of approach, then getting on the power as soon as possible. Now, I'm not comparing a modern supercar to an older F1 car, but the power to grip ratio is certainly closer in the older F1 cars to a supercar than it is to today's F1 cars. Then there is the suspension. Back in the 80s and 90s, the cars were incredibly rigid to get the floor as consistent with the ground as possible, meaning that the airflow under of the floor was more consistent and you could get more downforce. But this rock solid suspension setup didn't make the cars very compliant, so that meant they were pretty lively on the track, and especially so when bouncing over curbs or uneven tracks. Then there were the tyres. Now, we have done a video on all the ways that tyres have changed in Formula 1, but in short, race tyres back then were harder and so offered less grip. It also meant that the drivers didn't have to tiptoe on them, so driving the car in hard, rotating it mid-corner and having oversteer on the exit didn't hurt the tyres quite so much. And of course, if you did this in today's cars, you could say goodbye to a set of softs in about 3 laps. But all of this ragged driving made Formula 1 look absolutely awesome, like they're right on the edge. A lot of what was so impressive in Senna's qualifying laps was how active he was, driving right on the limit of grip, right to the limits of the track. And yes, drivers are going a lot faster now, but it just doesn't look like it. I've been lucky enough to drive a fair few 80s and 90s F1 cars. They're incredible fun. They feel pure, ragged, and like you're always quite close to having a big crash. You are naturally more aggressive on the steering as the cars are less well refined. It's basically a bit more difficult to drive them. But generally the fastest way to get around the circuit is to have the car rotated quite quickly in the middle of the corner. However, if you drive with this more aggressive style in a modern car, it simply wouldn't like it and you'd be pretty slow. The latest F1 car that I've driven is a 2012. I'm still waiting for the call from Mercedes. And the development, the refinement is really obvious. And because of that refinement, because the car is so good, the old aggressive style just doesn't make sense. And so if drivers drove like this today, it would leave them seconds off the pace, not to mention wearing out their tyres very quickly. So why do they all adopt this same style? Well, in terms of steering, braking and acceleration inputs, they all need to do the same thing because of the cars. The suspension is so sorted. The cars are so finely tuned that they are stable for the aero platform, whilst also being able to deal with the curbs and the undulations in the circuit. The balance the cars have now is honestly remarkable. This means that the load through each tyre is really balanced. The aero works best as the ride height is really stable, and bumps on the circuit don't do a whole lot to upset the car. And as grip has increased more than power has, it means that driving a smoother arc through the corner is quicker. So rather than being off the corner, the drivers take a racing line closer to what you would draw with a compass. We call this the geometric line. And this all means that the drivers are very smooth. The corner is a constant blend, coming off the brakes smoothly, introducing steering lock smoothly, and getting on the power smoothly. And another difference now is the telemetry and data. The lines the drivers take will be backed up by loads and loads of data, not to mention simulations at the factory. Practice sessions allowing them to drive, then go and check the data, then go again and work on how they drive the car. Whereas Senna and Schumacher, although they had some data, but not as much as now, were relying on their feel. What feels faster through a corner and over a lap. We actually went to the Turkish Grand Prix this year, and at turn 1 you could really see how smooth everyone was, except for the Hasses. That thing looked like an absolute nightmare. Oh, and that bit where Vettel came out in the wet on slicks, that also looked like a bit of a nightmare. And surprise, surprise, the smoothest, most refined drivers were Hamilton and Verstappen. You could really see how the brakes, steering and throttle all blended in one smooth motion through the corner. And I know I made a joke about the Haas, but it was really interesting to see the drivers drive that car. They were having to be much more aggressive on the steering wheel, hacking away to keep that thing in check. But where Senna was often driving around the turbo, today's drivers are driving around their tyres. So the main difference in their styles is in the racing lines that they choose, essentially how they load the tyres. Max and Vettel are examples of drivers who V off the line more than the others, whereas Lewis, Valtteri and Carlos all take much smoother geometric racing lines. And things are going to change a lot this season, with the cars changing so much, and I'm really excited to see how they all change their driving style to suit the new cars. We actually went over all of the changes to the new 2022 Formula 1 cars in this video. You should check it out. Thanks, and I'll catch you in the next one.